The notion of free trade has become really a slogan, a noise. Support for free trade really epitomizes, I think, what Gramsci was trying to get at when he spoke about hegemonic ideologies. Support is unquestioned. The recent debate, the current debate about Canada's signing of CETA has really brought that home. There was a panel discussion on the National, on the CBC. Jim Stanford, very well known, was the one person who was raising some questions. And I would suggest that in that event, not so much by Peter Mansbridge, but by the other participants, what Stanford had to say was treated literally with derision, if not contempt. I mean, people couldn't help smiling as you would smile at a little child who is playing with something he doesn't understand. And of course, the real tragedy is that economists, the economics profession, mainstream economics, basically supports this mantra. They qualify it amongst themselves, of course, because they are, quote, serious economists, but at the end of the day, this is one of the issues that is almost used as a litmus test for whether you're a serious economist. Krugman once wrote a paper in Challenge magazine, by the way, which I think is probably the best journal discussing economic issues, and one that's written in non-technical language. A marvelous article he published in 1995 in which he talks about how the consensus around structured adjustment emerged despite the fact that there was so little evidence to support it. And he talked about a self-reinforcing process in the world of affairs, the endless rounds of meetings, speeches, and communiques that occupy much of the time of economic opinion makers. Such social groupings tend at any time to converge on a conventional wisdom. People believe certain stories because everyone important tells them, and people tell those stories because everyone important believes them. Indeed, when a conventional wisdom is at its fullest strength, one's agreement with that wisdom becomes almost a litmus test of one's suitability to be taken seriously. And I think in economics that has been true, and certainly is true of free trade. I've lived through several decades of that kind of atmosphere. The extraordinary thing is that the foundations for this belief are truly extraordinarily weak, and acknowledged to be so, even by many of the most ardent practitioners. If you strip the whole story down, you really ultimately come to Ricardo, the Heckscher-Ohlin and all of those things. They were actually about very specific issues. Heckscher-Ohlin was about trying to predict how patterns of trade would evolve. It was overtaken by events. The real core of the argument was the one that Ricardo put on the table, and it rests on the concept of comparative advantage, which essentially says that even if one country is absolutely more efficient in producing all products, or as economists like to talk about, a two-commodity world, a two-product world, more efficient, absolutely more efficient in producing both products, then obviously it still remains true that the other country's resources should be used, and logically those resources should be used in which the second country in the production, those resources should be used in the second country in producing those goods and services in which it has the least relative disadvantage. That's as I put it in the alternative title I've used here. This is the small idea that helped to change the world. But the idea is ubiquitous. You will run into it constantly. But what people generally don't mention or realize is that the idea, to make sense at all, rests on the assumption of full employment. And the idea is used, the most critical use of the idea is to say that if a country sees an industry dying, the country in essence shouldn't be too concerned about this, because as the concept of comparative advantage allegedly tells us, the country should understand that what's actually happening is resources that were previously used in this industry are being liberated so that they will come to be used in activities in which the country has greater comparative advantage. Well, if you think about that just for a moment, you'll realize that's only true if you assume global full employment. But global full employment not only doesn't exist, it isn't even conceivable in the foreseeable future. So this concept is absolutely central to the argument, but it is deeply and fundamentally erroneous. Sir John Hicks actually wrote a wonderful small book at one point, great classical economist, in which he said that, yes, all these ideas might be sensible, but the real benefits to working people would only accrue after the world had reached full employment, and he speculated at the time that that might take 150 years. I think he was very optimistic. The idea was challenged very early on by people like Friedrich List and Carey, writing from countries that were chafing under the constraints of British industrial dominance, and they proposed a different concept, which essentially is best understood as dynamic comparative advantage. So that the idea is not that your trade should be determined, your trade pattern should be determined by your existing relative capacities, because the whole point of development is structural change over time. And therefore, once you understand that the real issue has to be dynamic comparative advantage, then you open the door to all kinds of, quote, interventionist policy instruments, including infant industry. And this pragmatic approach to trade was the one that, to use a shorthand which cuts across many of the important complexity Carey was just mentioning, that concept was the underlying foundation on which all successful industrialized economies industrialized. There are no exceptions to this. If you want, as Sanjay Lal once wrote in a brilliant paper they did for the World Bank, if you want to develop a sophisticated, competitive industry, then you have to invest in that process, and it takes a long time. This idea was also at the center of the first 20 years of the development debate, which was focused on the concept of nation building and the idea of import substitution as the necessary first step in building capacities, institutional capacities, technological skill capacities in countries was taken as given. It was taken as given by the World Bank, by the IMF. It was the point of departure of the whole story. It was contested, of course, and there were different degrees of latitude that should be given, that people thought should be given, and economists, as always, tended to try to minimize the degree to which one interfered in markets. Prebisch, of course, very important in that story, making a very powerful case for import substitution. But what's important to understand about Prebisch, and he's, in my view, totally misrepresented and misunderstood a good deal of the time, is Prebisch's support of import substitution was extraordinarily reluctant. If you read Prebisch's writings, he sees the world in a certain way, as Carey was suggesting. Primary commodity producers were trapped in a world where they were operating in what were essentially competitive markets. And what that meant is any productivity increases that were generated in those productive activities were immediately shared by consumers through lower prices. Industrial products, however, were produced in a different world, an essentially oligopolistic world. And there, the productivity increases were shared by other factors of production, particularly labor, which is why you had high wage economies and why the developing world was trapped in the low wage situation that defined development. And Prebisch ultimately agreed and argued that the developing countries ought to pursue import substitution policies, but his preferred option, and he made this very clear and spoke very passionately to this point, wrote very passionately to this point, his preferred solution was to make the production of industrial products equally competitive to the production of primary products. And indeed, he warned against some of the risks of the import substitution, the second best import substitution options. And in a certain sense, that part of his argument actually opened the door, or can be seen as a kind of precursor to what actually happened in the neoliberal era, with the difference, of course, as speakers yesterday pointed out, that none of the markets we're talking about are remotely competitive ultimately, because they are highly oligopolistic. But now, they're not oligopolistic in a form that allows gains to be shared with other factors of production. Now they're oligopolistic in a form which allows corporate interests in finance to absorb virtually all of the surplus that's being created. And in my view, that's the best way to think about the transition of the world to the world of the free trade agreements. What is at the center of global political economy today, in my view, is the struggle over technology rents. And that struggle is not between some countries exploiting some other countries. The struggle is between corporations denying societies or nation states the ability to formulate policy structures that would allow the social investments which inevitably go into the development of these technologies to be reaped by the society that actually made those investments. Oui. Sorry. The final point that I want to draw out is that methodologically and theoretically, the only way that we can hope to think about trade policy, to devise more sensible trade policies, is to accept that analytically we need to take a political economy approach. It has to be historically based. And when we do that, when we look at the historical record, there is no question that there were periods, and I would say that 30-year period that Kerry referred to, I refer to it as the Golden Age, showed that the market can be forced to function differently, to produce different outcomes. That outcome is particularly illustrated in this graph. This is what U.S. family income between 1947 and 1979. It shows very large real income increases. It shows they were very widely distributed. And behind those numbers are a whole lot of other very positive features that characterize that era. If we now go to the next slide, we see the story in the neoliberal era. We see that growth, first of all, is much, much lower. And secondly, it is wildly unequally distributed. And if we took this graph to the present, the picture would be even more grotesque. I particularly love this slide. This is the income in the United States going to the top 10%. This is the 1920s. This is the golden era. This is the current situation. And the essence of the golden age, as I would call it, is it was an era when capital was embedded, when markets were embedded, and that forced capital to work in conjunction with other social interests. Keynes wrote, unless the rate of interest is nationally determined, no society is able to pursue its own social experiments. And that is the issue. We need to get back there. I don't know how we're going to do it. I realize it's going to be extremely difficult. I think in the end, I would say we are left with Marx's dilemma. Marx, after all, was an analyst of capitalism. He wrote very little about socialism. And his fundamental and lasting contribution to the analysis of capitalism was the understanding that at the heart of capitalism there is a deep contradiction, which leads to that system periodically generating fundamental crises in which the benefits of economic growth and of technological growth cease to be translated into positive social and human outcomes. He hypothesized a proletariat as the actor that would deal with these contradictions. That part of his theory, I would say, has not been validated by history. The analysis remains and the challenge remains. We need to find a way of re-embedding markets, and if we cannot, then we will be fated to live in the world that we live in now.